Welcome back to another episode of Web3 Builders. I'm Evan. Will is sick. He's out. We are joined today by Danny Ryan, who is here to defend Ethereum. Um, so I guess before we start talking about Lido, let's talk about. I'm curious because the merge was a year ago, and but it's probably been like 2 years since you basically had worked on the merge code, right? So you write the spec. You're one of the people that writes the spec in Python, and then I guess I'm just curious, how does it feel, when it's code that I guess it's not literally your code that's exactly going into production, but it's got to be kind of a weird feeling, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's mine and many other people's ideas, right? That then become specifications that are in weird Python format. And then there's huge delay between, people coming up with the ideas, formalizing them into specs, and then people actually like working on them, right? Like we're like on the cusp of 4844, modern scaling solution coming out, and like a lot of that foundation was done like at the middle of last year, and it's just been like minor iteration from like the specification standpoint since then. And so like, yeah, you definitely kind of like watch the world continue to move as things get into production. Sometimes like the world shifts massively under your feet in ways that matter, and sometimes not. If we were like working on a cryptographic curve, like that's not that crazy. Like the math is the math, and then it gets into production. Whereas like when you're working on proof of stake kind of stuff, like the emergent ecosystem, emergent behavior, further understanding of proof of stake in the abstract, like continues to grow and evolve. So you definitely deal with like pretty major like time delays and realizing there are problems, addressing the problems in the abstract, and then actually seeing them get into the world. Um, it's a very dynamic system. It's a lot to parse.
So speaking of numbers changing, well, I guess it depends on whether they're isogenies, because I think a year ago at Stanford Blockchain was exactly when the isogenies got rug pulled.
Oh,
Somebody
right.
found a bug. So they
Yeah,
were
yeah.
almost
I
going to
think
be.
Antonio from our team would say isogenies are still okay. There's just this one thing in isogenies that like we don't want to use anymore. But people are still pretty into it. So um, yeah, but that's beyond my expertise.
Well, I mean, so the day we're recording this is the day after the EF cryptography team said, VDFs? Ha ha ha.
Yeah, there were some lessons learned there. I mean, the like pure theoretical version of VDF that has these properties where you can bound a commodity hardware versus some no expense paid attacker, like this is a very powerful cryptographic primitive, and like if you could instantiate that in the world, you could do a lot of like really cool designs in blockchains and probably otherwise. We've tried a couple of instantiations and hit roadblocks, and I mean this second one, quite frankly, it was just like a huge error in the order of operations. We did like created this piece of hardware and did like a kind of semi-production test run. The hardware works, it's very exciting. And then everyone's like, you know what? We should probably get a bunch of cryptographers in a room and make sure this thing is like Loctite. And everyone thought it was Loctite. And then 2 days in, they're like, oh, this is totally broken. I recommend anyone that's building some hardware with advanced cryptography, have the crypto break session before you build the hardware. But then, I think a lot of different things come to light. Like there's probably some like deeper formalizations we can have in the abstract on VDFs in general, and then also like much more time should be spent on the theory rather than getting into the practice. So probably not the path right now. That doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't paths. It doesn't necessarily mean that we won't see like VDFs and
There are
interesting.
paths to VDFs, possibly.
I I think that people want to go back to the drawing board and make sure we get it right the next time we try something. By we, I mean not just Ethereum, like the whole kind of cryptography community. But there's also like what problem are we trying to solve? There's two problems I think the VDF is trying to solve. One is to like reduce the biasability of proposer and attester selection, which it's like marginally biasable. And then the other is to expose like strong randomness to the application layer. And that's really like one of the big driving forces, or at least many years ago when this project was started, to do VDFs is like exposing strong randomness into the application layer. If you set that aside and you focus just on the biasability, there's probably other cryptographic constructions that would work. I mean, there's obviously like DKG, like distributed key generation stuff that has liveness problems if you don't have, 2/3 online. But there's other things like if you're willing to relax your things, like maybe it's biasable, but you could bias yourself out. Like if you're willing to accept some of these other like assumptions, you might be able to come up with simpler cryptographic primitives. So there's kind of like let's take a breather from the VDFs. Let's think about the VDFs from a more abstract standpoint, but let's also like think about what other solutions might be acceptable to solve some of our problems.
So what I hear you saying is like VDFs, there might be a path, but maybe it doesn't make sense to go down them. There's other things we can do on the biasability. And I guess this sort of goes back to what we were saying about, things change and assumptions change about what the more important problem is to be worked on. And right now, I mean, the biasability of Randau is there, but it's not that significant. We don't know of anyone doing it, right?
It's so the last revealer of proposer gets 1 bit of biasability, of like a 256-bit seed. So to actually like significantly bias, you need many last proposers in a sequence. So if you are Lido or if you are Coinbase, then you do get many last proposers on some frequency, and you could bias. But the biasability, the way you do it is you actually like strategically produce and don't produce blocks. So like if you have the last 8 blocks in an epoch, you have 8 bits, and you can think of like producing a block as a 1 and not producing a block as a 0, and you can like try to construct a number. It's a bit of like a reduction there, but like so the only way to do so is to like be strategically not producing blocks, and it would be very
And
clear
then you're
if
foregoing your rewards and your MEV. Although you might, I guess, if you get multiple blocks in a
Well,
row.
right, but you're trying, yeah, like you're trying to, by doing so, you're trying to like bias the future, so you get maybe more rewards in the future, at the expense of now. So like, yes, the immediate incentive is probably just to like make the block. The second order incentive is like this is very obvious behavior, and like that I don't behavior of the community would be like what the fuck, and potentially like intervene. It's the kind of thing that like there are certainly like community interventions that can happen, and on these like edge cases or areas where we don't have like perfect security, in the event that shit goes down, it all of a sudden becomes the top R&D item. So like maybe this is something that we can solve over the next 5 years, but if somebody starts hacking on it, then it's something we need to solve in the next 18 months.
Yeah, so there's only, I mean, at this point, like Lido and Coinbase at this current level of at the reality of who has what stake right now, basically, that could do that. I take it. So
Yeah, I mean, there's always 2 avenues. There's like the hard fork and the soft fork in terms of like removing an actual like attacker and threat. So like the hard fork is like the extreme of socially slash and just be like capital's gone. Sorry, later. Like uh you know the protocol at its extremes can be fucked with, as any protocol can be, and you broke the social contract, you're out. The other is soft forking, right? So you could actually just not listen to their attestations and blocks, at which point they would suffer an activity leak and have to exit and withdraw. They would lose quite a bit of capital in terms of the leak in relation to like the exit queue and getting out, but it wouldn't be as extreme as just turning the knob to 0.
so that's a client setting that people could configure their clients, or they would be released like that possibly.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
if that happens and they're over a third, though, then the whole network loses finality.
For some stretch of time, yes, yes,
Yeah, until they get knocked out. Okay.
yeah.
Um,
Which Gasper, the consensus protocol, has its warts, and it's something that people are always kind of thinking about how to improve. But the fact that the chain can stay online, and like available and produce blocks and ultimately finalize, is pretty like sweet property, and one that we've actually seen save our asses in production, right? Like, I can't remember exactly, but say Prism's gone offline, and all of a sudden, we're below 2/3 attestation threshold, and we're not finalizing. We do make progress. We do make blocks, and then once that issue is repaired or people leak enough, the the chain finalizes. And so, like, I think at least on a couple of occasions, we've seen that like be a really, really positive feature, and so that would help us work through such an event.
Before we get to Lido, so we've talked about the biasability of of Randall. How about the application layer? Is there any sort of things that's a hard one, right? Is there anything thought of for that?
In terms of like the thing that we wanted VDFs to bring, which is unbiasable randomness. Yeah, I mean, pre-Randall, which is a random number, it is this value that comes out of the protocol that is biasable. It is exposed to the execution layer now, um, which is good. It took actually over the opcode number that difficulty was, because we did an analysis, or there's analysis done of the actual usage of difficulty, and it was only used for like really bad randomness. And so any application after the merge got a boost in their randomness, and people can then use it knowing the limitations and knowing
So
that
those
there
early
is.
Ponzi schemes that were deployed on Ethereum in like 2016, they now
Yeah,
have
they're
better
actually they're
randomness.
better now. They're less biasable now. Um, yeah, I guess just any sort of like on-chain lottery, you end up with kind of like a crypto economic cap on what you'd want to do there, because at a certain threshold, it all of a sudden becomes valuable enough for like cartels to be manipulating the lottery app, the application layer. So, I mean, from the consensus layer. And so there are a number of like other randomness oracles in other than Randall. So there's probably like you could probably construct something that's pretty reasonable in terms of like mixing and making some assumption that like not all of them would be corrupt at the same time. But it's not like that satisfying of a solution. I really do think it'd be like quite excellent to have unbiased randomness. I just don't think that's on the 3 to 4 year time horizon, especially with like the VDF setbacks, because that's that and distributed key generation, DKG stuff, are really like the only two potentials there. And the DKG stuff has the problem of liveness needing like certain thresholds of validators being online, which is maybe an acceptable trade-off for the application layer, but one that we haven't really gone down right now.
There's a different thing I wanted to say about VDFs, which I guess gets into Lido, which is the VDF post came out yesterday, and it was signed by the cryptography team. And in math, science, academic terms, it is basically what I said earlier. It's like VDFs, ha ha ha. But nobody I know, and I've talked to like a decent number of people in the last day, got that message. like, and I mean, I think this actually has a lot is very relevant to the like what we're about to talk about with Lido, right? Because until somebody like blows it up, like a Bitcoiner blows it up with some like misinformation that is like, look, like VDFs, blah blah blah, or whatever. They spent $80 million on hardware, and
It wasn't $80 million, by the way.
I know. We'll see. We need the misinformation, otherwise it won't blow up, and nobody will hear about it.
Right, right. So you're saying, you need the foil, you need the battle to surface information. I guess like or another point is like a technical post without like the yelling on the internet and the thought leading and the whatever like often falls flat. And we pride ourselves in Ethereum and like everything is open, right? Like you can watch all core devs, you can like go look at people's GitHubs, but like no one does, because it's hard. and there's too much information, there's too much to parse, and so you actually need like some sort of like meta parsing, meta debate, meta whatever to actually like surface what's relevant. But then at the same time, that becomes like difficult to parse as well, because then you're just like on a team. It's kind of like politics in America. You're like, you're going for the red team or the blue team, and it's like most people don't really even know why. It's just their team. Um,
Yeah. Well, I mean, nobody I know has like figured out that VDFs are at least dead for now. I mean, literally no one I've talked to in the past day, despite me retweeting like those posts like multiple times yesterday. And like these are my friends, and I like asked them like, did you know that VDFs got killed yesterday? No, nobody. I mean, and it's crazy to me, but I mean, outside of causing the controversy, I don't even know exactly. Like, you know, I have I found in a newsletter. I assume there will be something in the newsletter. Some people will get that from like
yeah,
it being a line there, but it's
the
hard to like
newsletter is
make it
great. I still love the
interesting.
newsletter.
Well, it's hard to make it interesting enough for people to even get it, right? Because like unless like
Yeah,
VDFs, like what do I even what does Andrew
yeah.
say or what do I tell him to say? It's like, well, VDFs are VDFs are not alive at the moment.
Yeah. Maybe you need a Bitcoin alt to like debate. The things that you need to surface, you get the Bitcoin alt to FUD, and then you come in, and then that's probably the strategy here.
I literally was thinking about that yesterday of training a like literally taking an LLM and you know scraping some of the worst Bitcoin maximalists. Not necessarily like the worst in terms of
And making a monster.
yeah, not necessarily in terms of toxic, but in terms of like pumping, right? And so training taking this data set, I don't think it would be that hard because these people have like thousands and thousands of tweets. Taking the words out and training the updating the LLM on the stuff, and then just making a Twitter account that tweets every 4 hours with some sort of entropy in there, so it's not in exactly 4 hours. And then I use that as the thing that the funny thing is I think that account would very quickly have lots of followers. I mean, I think that sort of gets into our next topic, which is Lido. I think you wrote in July of 2022, dangers of LSDs.
I'm still
It's
very proud of coining that acronym, even though people have tried to go to LST because they're not derivatives, they're tokens. So yeah, I wrote that piece over a year ago now. It seemed apparent that like a problem was emerging, and it just like wasn't part of the conversation. It wasn't like something that people were thinking very deeply about, and it's the thing keeping me up at night. I got a few other things these days, but this is still one of those big things that's like you know uh, Lido or some similar protocol that short circuits the economics and essentially forms a cartel, shoves a governance token owned by a bunch of VCs into the center of the protocol is like a systemic threat to Ethereum. It's like clearly one of the biggest systemic threats to Ethereum. And my thinking, I'm sure, has evolved since I wrote this over a year ago. I was kind of taking a look at it this morning, but I think the risks still stand. I think that a protocol being cavalier about these risks and flirting with that 1/3 threshold, and very ambitious to try to exceed that 50% threshold and even try to get essentially everything, is not it's not a good thing for Ethereum, and that it can cause a lot of pain and damage. I think it's something that we can recover from, but I think it's a path that we might as well avoid. And I do think that people, there's a bit of a tragedy of the commons problem here, where like, sure, but it's good for me, so I'm going to stake. I sympathize with the tragedy of the commons here, but I do believe that it's not only not good for Ethereum and ETH the asset, if people continue to stake at those thresholds, but I also don't think it's good for like the LDO token and stuff, because they're actually ultimately, by not self-limiting and attempting to kind of like gobble up the entire pie, that they actually will ultimately devalue the system that they're building on top of and rely upon. Yeah, there's a lot there, but I would reiterate first and foremost, like, staking with Lido at those thresholds, or staking with any sort of protocol, centralized or not, or central operator or something more like Lido, is not it's not good for Ethereum, and it's not ultimately good for the assets that you're staking. And I would reiterate and suggest to all sorts of staking protocols that, like, having caps is not only good for Ethereum, but it's good for you because you rely on Ethereum.
So,
Um,
so
I think, yeah, go on.
I've thought about. So I'm starting a staking service in part. Entirely because Lido is a threat, and uh, it's not doesn't have an LSD. Uh, but having done the numbers, it's actually hard to make money. And that's why they're trying to
Yeah,
get
yeah,
all the like Lido is worth billions of dollars or whatever the token is, and in order to justify that, they sort of have to take over Ethereum, right? There's no other way based on numbers that it's really worth that. So there's a reason, and to be fair, they have been fairly honest about it in the past, about how they are trying to take over and be the middleware that everybody uses. I want to reiterate this. I've said it before, but in their vote to self-limit, they they voted against self-limiting, so no cap, and 99% of tokens voted for no cap. But if the top three that voted had flipped, then they would have capped. Like, the vote would have flipped, right? So it very clearly puts it, like, into perspective. Like, it's only three people that decided that vote.
yeah, which is absurd. I mean, a failure in, like, governance, and just most token distributions these days are like VC allocated, controlled by a handful of people, and aren't what we'd call decentralized, and are just like shitty reinstantiations of corporations on chain. And so uh, I think that's another reason that people should consider Lido or anything else that begins to look like this as like a threat to Ethereum, because it's a corporatization, a centralization, and a systemic threat. What happens when the regulator realizes three people control the vote? I got three doors to knock on, easy, you know, um, and all of a sudden Lido's governance around operators becomes, yeah, you must censor, of course, obvious. It's just like, for a system underlying that is like not not perfect, but like truly like a global and pretty decentralized movement, um, to layer a pretty centralized component on top and put all the eggs in that basket is just, it's going to cause problems. And again, problems that can be recovered from, but not without like a lot of pain.
Let's talk about. So we are at the moment we are at 32.3% of stake is Lido. The next biggest is Coinbase, which has like 6.5. Lido is much bigger. So we don't think they've reached a third yet. But when they've reached a third, the liveness of the network and the finality of the network as its stake. Is there anything more to say to that at a third?
That's really the thing that becomes an issue at a third. Like, at a third, um, a if someone served those three operators at Lido, or three people controlling Lido, and they say shut it down, then we have an issue with the liveness of the network. The liveness being the finality, not necessarily the availability of the chain. Like I said, you could still have an available chain. You could make some decisions about it, but you're not going to get those economically final decisions. Um, and so that's definitely the real issue there. And I do think that, like, um, it's much easier to at the 50% and 2/3 threshold to like really talk about like disaster scenarios like this. That's like pretty recoverable scenario, but it just becomes like uh, one, it's where we begin to potentially have issues, and two, it's where we've like kind of seeded caring, right? Like if someone crosses 1/3 and people don't give a shit, then like the immune system of the Ethereum community is clearly not as strong as it needs to be, as we hoped it could be. And if something doesn't happen at 1/3, then is it going to happen at 50%? Maybe, but there's also a lot of time to erode norms and uh, convince people of safety and other things that are not necessarily true between now and then. So I think it's very important and critical to have like a very healthy and strong immune system at the first key critical threshold, which is 1/3.
Where should we try to get it to? Like, I mean, you know, should we? I
I mean,
mean,
I
because
wrote,
everyone has different numbers. Yeah, I think you would say
yeah,
15%. I think Vitalik
I
says
said
25%.
25. I said like self limit at 25 in that post. Like that's like I can sleep good at night kind of number. That's like nothing's going to radically change very quickly, and we're going to be like fighting the issue again. I do think that like sub 20 is like, yeah, we're safe, we're happy, we're like in a pretty good spot, and like anything like decreasingly below that and better distributions are better and better. And so like I there's not a magic number. There's just being close or not to critical thresholds.
I think the fact that there is no magic number has actually been one of the problems, right? Because people will say, well, like, oh,
Interesting.
like if it's like one of those coordination problems that we haven't solved. And because everyone has a different number, you said 25,
Yeah.
Fizz says 22. I think Vitalik's at 15 at one point, something like that. But
Yeah.
everybody has a different number, and so it's been like this sort of thing. I think 33 is a third is a pretty good one to fight. I mean, we're at 32.3, so we have an entire
Yeah, but
percent
if
that we
you
can
if you
fight back
say
with.
don't exceed a third, then you're constantly fighting. You could be constantly fighting. Whereas like, if it's comfortably below, then you have a lot of time between like when you've gotten the warning signal and when you actually reach like the security threshold. So I mean I agree. I there's not a science behind the number.
So, like 20 years ago now, I was talking to a guy who works in politics, who works in communications, about what he did, and he used to say that basically what I do is I take the complicated policy stuff and I write it down in crayon for everybody else. This guy is actually quite controversial, but let's ignore that. I thought it was a uh, great little like blob of what he did. Sometimes I feel like that's what I do in Ethereum, um, but I have been surprised by how people don't accept that Lido is like an attack and they want to say like, oh, this is totally fine, and like I can't believe you said it's a Lido attack. As if having a centralization factor of three people who control a vote on things that they can do with a third of stake is an issue. And
I mean the worst attacks in blockchain are economic attacks. It's very difficult to attack the cryptography. It's actually pretty difficult to attack the P2P in like an aggregate way. Like the most effective attacks are either finding literal software bugs, which is like most of DeFi attacks, or finding economic, trying to exploit the economics. And so like, sure, you might say, no, it's not an attack. It's just like the economics of the situation. But like, what are these crypto economic systems if not like the checks and balances between kind of the economics at play? And so sure, like when we say attack, we think like someone behind the scenes like going like I'm gonna get it. I don't know. I mean I don't know if that's how it's played, but it's certainly like an economic construction and an attempt to kind of short circuit the economics of the system. And you know I this goes into like the lead time stuff from when you were at the beginning of the podcast. Like there's a huge lead time between like when things are designed and when they actually go into production. And a lot of the core of the beacon chain was designed 4 or 5 years ago. A lot of things have changed since then. One, like, how do you construct scale? Like, totally different. Like, we found simpler and more decentralized ways to construct scale. We also learned about MEV. MEV, like, from in the abstract, didn't really exist, and like there were some certain early like theories around it, but it wasn't really happening in practice. Similarly, like how LSTs would be constructed and the impact of those on security, like that did not exist 5 years ago. And so like the design and theory and construction of economics and the particulars of the beacon chain were in like a different regime. And that's just like a product of reality. Like sure, maybe someone could have sat down and thought more deeply about each of these things and like fixed it and made it perfect. But Ethereum is evolving and like in a yeah, I know. Like, but Ethereum's evolving in like a very dynamic landscape, and like has to, at least for some amount of time, be able to like react and adapt to emergent phenomenon and research. I wish that was not the case. I wish it was done, but it's quite frankly not. Um, and uh, Very likely due to the impact of MEV, due to the impact of LSDs and other things, there are like economic tweaks that have to happen to the system. Can they follow the principles of like minimum viable issuance? Probably. Can they be like minimally disruptive? Hopefully. Can we get into an equilibrium in which like we never have to fuck with it again? I sure as hell hope so, because like I don't think it's healthy or viable to like continue to have to play like whack-a-mole in this type of system. But I think if you talk to anyone that thinks deeply about economics, talk to Barnaby at the rig team, talk to literally anyone, they're going to say we're not at the equilibrium yet. We have to make uh, adjustments. And so like the latest controversy of the past week is EIP 7514.
Hold on, let's get to that in a second. But first, I want to say, like going back to the crayon thing. Um, of course, one of my crayon things is like calling it attack because I feel like nobody else was until I started saying that, and I think it's an obvious thing. And maybe people don't want to make it like personal or whatever, but whatever. But beyond that, I think one thing is that uh, at a if we have Lido at a third, we are basically proof of work. It's like we are the centralization of proof of work system that we used to have, and that Bitcoin has. Like we are not any more decentralized than we used to be, which is, to be fair, like it was okay. We managed to survive. Bitcoin managed to survive, but uh, we're just a more environmentally friendly proof of work. Would you agree with that,
with
or would
with
you?
with better recovery modes.
Okay, that's fair.
So
Yeah.
I like, I don't even know who the big miner is. Call it Bitmain. I mean, he might not even exist anymore. I have no idea.
Foundry
Bitmain
has
starts
something like 33% of Bitcoin block,
okay.
like the
Foundry starts fucking with stuff. They start doing selfish mining, or they like cartelize above 50% threshold. Like, you don't really have recovery methods. One, it's like hard to tell. It's hard to detect. And two, like the only thing you can do is brick everyone's hardware, including the good guys and the bad guys. And I've talked about this for years and years, but the at least like the big difference here, clearly there are centralization incentives here in both systems, but at least we can acknowledge an attack and adjust. Like the Ethereum community, the Ethereum users, uh, have this platform for themselves, for the good about building applications, for the other things. It's not really about the underlying like crypto economic actors that are showing up to secure the system. Like they do that because they're incentivized to do so. But if they act poorly, then like the users should take things into their hands and move forward.
I guess before we move on to 7514, you said earlier, this does affect the value of your ETH. I have to say personally, if we breach a third, I am significantly less bullish on ETH, the asset. I mean, I like just pure honesty. Like
Yeah, I don't spend a lot of time in speculation, but it's I've made it very clear in my posts, and I'll say it again, like exceeding these key thresholds and the community not giving a shit, and economic actors here not giving a shit and like continuing forward and like not reacting to exceeding those thresholds, it's not good for the value of Ethereum.
It's just not good for our decentralization, our credible neutrality, and I mean, ultimately, like that is, in my opinion, what gives value to these systems.
And that's, maybe there are better constructions, and a lot of people are spending a lot of time thinking about, are there tweaks to the economics here that can like make this a much less viable path. And in the event that we figure that out, great. But I think to give us the breathing room to get there, and not have like terrible equilibriums take place in which the system degrades into a kind of a centralized mess. Everyone should be making like very conscious decisions about capital allocation, to so that the system can move forward before we get there.
That was an understated way to say get your crap out of Lido. Conscious capital allocation.
Yeah, yeah. Also, where the hell are all the other LSTs? Shouldn't they? I figured there'd be like a great a reshuffling where like fucking you can have tokens if you like exit Lido and come stake with me. Like where I'm so surprised. One of like some of this might be fundamental in relation to like economics and the construction of the system, but like where are the competitors? Where are the people that are like, yeah, where's the vampire attack? Where are the people that are hungry? I it's kind of shocking to me. Like it seems much more like this is a there are probably things that can and should be tuned in respect to the beacon chain economics, but like a lot of this seems like this is just this instantiation of the problem. This is like a very competent first mover and a super incompetent no second mover, right? It's like it's kind of shocking to me that people have not stepped in and tried to like shake up the boat a little bit.
Let's talk about 7514. You said things that keep you up at night? Because there's two ways to look at 7514. One is that it's about Lido. Two is that it's about P2P layer. I think they're probably both true.
I'm going to say first and foremost, this is an engineering concern. The way that the beacon chain was constructed is that validators are all 32 ETH units. This was because in our understanding of scaling designs at the time, we needed to have shuffling into committees. And so we needed these like individual units of consensus actors to like distribute across the network. That is no longer the precise path to get scale out of the beacon chain and out of Ethereum. But we're left with kind of that like 5-year-old design decision. And so we have tons of these consensus entities, tons of these signatures. And it's actually like it's incredible that this system's been constructed that you can have so many signatures and messages flying around and it actually works. But with each new validator, each new 32 ETH deposited, you get another little linear piece of the load to the network in terms of the consensus overhead. And quite frankly, Perry, who's at the DevOps teams at the EF, and a number of others, ran a number of like tests with, I think it's 2.1 million validators. How many validators do we have right now? There's 800,000 validators right now. So 2.1 million of these like consensus entities, 32 ETH entities sending signatures around the network. And quite frankly, the test didn't work. Like it failed. The engineering, the clients are getting better all the time, and they have like crazy cool like innovations all the time to like handle more load and like have this like work. But to jump from 800,000 to 2.1 million, the wheels fell off the bus. And so first and foremost, like the 7514, which makes the deposit entry queue have a maximum of 8 instead of scaling linearly with the set, is to buy researchers time to think about specification changes and to buy engineers time to work on optimizations, such that we don't hit somewhere in that, around 2 million, 1.8 million, we don't know exact number, where like the wheels start falling off the bus.
Crayon on that for anybody paying attention is just that like we're putting a ceiling on how big the amount of ETH staked can grow. Just in case anybody didn't get that.
Yeah, like the rate, because right now like the rate of ETH stake growth scales with the size of validator set. So like, if you have 1 million validators, you can actually induct more validators And this instead just keep that ends up, you can have an exponential curve. Obviously, this is also related to the economics of staking. Is it worth staking, at a given amount of return? But to not be able to get to that number quite as quickly, and to give us time to think about these inherent problems, and to give engineers time to optimize the hell out of the system, um, there's essentially like a rate limit adjustment there. Secondly, there are some fundamental questions about like target stake rate. There are fundamental questions around the impact of LSDs and centralization. There are fundamental questions more about the kind of the economics of the system, and this is dual purpose. It gives breathing room for the like very critical engineering problems, um, and it gives breathing room for kind of the understanding the economics of this like very dynamic and live system, which people are spending a lot of time on, and we're beginning to understand more and more. But like, it's not quite to the point where it's actionable. So there are, some claim this is rushed. Some claim that this is a band-aid. I don't like that it was rushed.
Some context on Rushed, even there, right, is that it's been around for months now. So I said Rushed. So I mean, I can kind of take my L on that.
Yeah, yeah. So Daplion wrote the proposal in July. It was presented on a call in July. Daplion brought it up again on a call a couple of calls ago, public live call, the All Core Devs consensus layer call, and pretty much just like, we need to maybe do this. And everyone's like, yeah, we kind of maybe do need to do this. There was a non appetite to make a decision on that call, but for especially the engineers that are on the front lines, making sure that the software actually works, to think about it for a week. And they unanimously, the consensus layer people came back a week later being like, yeah, we need some breathing room. And this is the simplest way to get there.
Ultimately, like it's probably in the next fork is when we make it so that you can have multiple, where like we change the cap from 32 to greater.
Yeah. There's this value called effective balance, max effective balance, and it's essentially like, what's even if you have balances in your validator exceeding this, like they don't really count towards your rewards, and they don't count towards the consensus security. And that's 32. That's really like that where that number 32 ETH comes from. There is a lot of iteration on a proposal called max EB, or max effective balance change, to do some things such that you could not only have a 32th validator, but you could have on the range of 32 to some other maximum, call it like 2048 or something. I think that's the value that's currently in the proposal. And that thus, if you wanted to stake 64 ETH, you could actually have one consensus entity instead of two. And if you had tons of these, you could also consolidate. Um, this does seem like a very valuable direction to be exploring. I do think that there's like increasing consensus amongst the consensus layer devs that like this is like simple enough and does help target this like load problem. Um, but the next fork's called Electra on the consensus layer. We haven't quite started having those conversations. So there's like a list of things that are going to probably be under consideration. People have been presenting proposals, but we haven't gotten into like okay, what's actually going to go in. We're trying to kind of get over the Deneb threshold of like it's done, and we're like doing test nets before we have that conversation. So I imagine the next like 6 weeks we're beginning to have that conversation. And my at least like gauge of the temperature is it has a high likelihood of going in. And so the nice thing there is that of the two problems, like what are the long-term kind of economic equilibriums, and can we help work on this load problem? It really does help solve that load problem without really getting into much of an economic difference, which is good. And so I think there's a lot of appetite for it. That doesn't necessarily solve some of the like longer term economic equilibrium problems, which are probably going to require some amount of tweaks. Um,
Yeah, raising the cap to on 32 for this fork would be rushed, but it's most likely going to the next fork.
Yeah, like this activation queue thing. Um, it's like about as simple of a change to the specification to client as you can imagine. It's like adding one if statement and a new constant value. Um, and this other thing is not like a crazy rework. Like it's definitely moderate bread and butter in terms of like complexity of a change to the consensus layer, but it's like we'll take some deeper thought in terms of getting the specifications right, and easily will take a client like a month or two to implement and test. So it's not quite there, and I think there's like a ton of appetite for getting this like proto-dank sharding scaling solution, so it's just not worth derailing for that.
So the downside, of course, of this is that Lido, it makes it harder to lower that number from around a third back to whatever we wanted it to be at 10%, because the queue is like, it's hard to get people to withdraw because then they can't get their queue back in.
Yeah, there are definitely like some second order effects, right? There's definitely the like, um, if it exacerbates like the time preference on staking, like I can't stake, I can't add new stake because it's going to take X number of time. So instead, I need to like buy into a staked position like Lido or something like that. And so I do think that there are minor second order effects, but I do think that like the positivity of giving the entire system breathing room for like a number of these things outweighs that. I will note that there's an asymmetry here. So the exit queue still does scale with the size of the validator set, whereas the activation queue does have that cap. And so like getting out is just as easy as it was in the past. Getting in is not necessarily. I'll also point out that like I do want to see like a major reshuffling, but almost all capital coming in. Most of it, like most adjustments in like stake distributions are related to new capital coming in and finding where its home is, rather than like old capital shifting around. I wish that was not the case though. So like you're right. Um, I do have a desire to see a reshuffling, and this it does impact it to some amount.
One problem I hear when I talk to people is that Lido is the least risky staking option. You've already said
Yeah,
this
I,
multiple
I,
times, but let's let them hear it again. What do you think about that?
I don't know. I don't know where like that would come from. So for one, like you're like creating systemic risk for the system and the system that your assets are relying upon the value from. And so like all like in terms of like staking with a major provider like that, like you're entering into a risky position. You're also entering a risky position where like some people are legitimately like, yeah, we should probably soft fork that capital out if it actually sees these thresholds. And like you don't want to be in there if that happens. So you don't want to be entangled in that mess. Um, it's also like smart contract risk is real, like very real. And so like any staking solution that you're relying upon smart contract risk and upgradable smart contract risk is like, I don't know. I'm not very risk. I'm very risk averse in terms of my smart contract risk. So I'm just like that just looks like a huge pile of risk. It also has like governance risk. There's a handful of operators that can like change the rules of what Lido and stake deep is at any given point. And so like there's just all sorts of risks. And so it's very unclear to me that it's like the least risky solution. It's like definitely an easy solution. And that's probably the biggest problem here. I do think what people are probably saying in that is like in relation to other LSTs that might have less mature dev teams or less battle tested smart contracts or things like that. But then you're trading some of those risks with even more meta risks of like, is all of Lido going to be you know um, have some deep issues. So I I don't know. There's definitely like everything's a risk assessment, and I understand why people might think the thing that has all the capital in it is like the obvious place to go, but I think that's a pretty naive assessment.
It also, I mean, I did say this, but it also has oracle risk, which, in my opinion, is like very non-negligible, and especially when you're talking about attacks on the system, it's very significant. Whenever I talk to people, they literally tell me, and I'm not looking for sympathy here or anything like that, but they literally tell me like, "Oh, like you're exaggerating," and they say things like, "Look, like nobody is like basically backing you up." Like the core devs aren't talking. Like researchers, like Danny wrote a piece a year ago, and that's it. And he's like tweeted a couple times, but like maybe it's just Danny, and like they like literally they don't think that like people are speaking with a unified voice. And how do we solve that? I mean, it's like we have this coordination technology, but we are not coordinating on this issue, and like in my opinion, the Lido attackers are taking advantage of it.
Yeah, I mean, I was part of a research retreat of like 30 people, like a month ago. And there were like a handful of top items and top priorities, and like this was the one of the top three. You know, it was like how do you get scale beyond 4844 and like a couple other things. And so at least from my conversations in circles, like this is like top of mind and things people are talking about all the time. Um, I I think that, I mean, in terms of my interaction, I just don't debate a lot on Twitter because it's like uh, I'm busy and it's not good for my it's not good for my mental health. I'm sorry. So I'm relying on you. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's probably some work to do on a unified front. There's probably some work to do to make sure that like some of these conversations that I'm a part of, that the actual like thinking and research and stuff surfaces, because I'm not alone. Um, and uh, there are many core devs who sorry, I use quotes there because I don't know what that word means, but the
Nobody does. Yeah.
I think a meme's a core dev, right?
Yeah.
Um, the
He was more of a
Yeah, I
core
don't know.
dev
This
than
is
some of the people on that call.
Yeah. There's definitely like there's a lot of people that like this is a very high concern and priority. So I'm there's definitely work to do on like increasing the conversation, and maybe like a Dev Connect. This is something that we could be talking about and making a bit more public in November. But I'm sorry that you're in the trenches alone. And this is like a very important problem.
All we have to do is take over Vitalik's Twitter account. Just kidding. Take that part out. Maybe. Um, a quick digression to the 4844. So,
Yep.
the bottleneck, like I asked Vitalik this in our conversation with him. Is it latency or is it like disk IO? Like in terms of increasing the number of blobs? Did,
Um, that's a good question. So like the storage requirement, given like a 2 to 3 week prune time, like isn't that crazy. It's on the order of like, I don't know, 80 gigabytes or something at the current. So like that's a fixed amount that gets added to like a storage requirement of a node. So it's not that. It really is like the um, latency and distribution of these things and overloading bandwidth and doing so. The blobs are distributed independently, and so there's a nice thing where you have this like the P2P mesh, and like if you sent me all the blobs at the same time, it might like saturate my connection and make things really slow. But because the blobs are sent independently, they all have their like own different paths, and so it actually like parallelizes and uses the network pretty good. But we don't have like a great understanding of where we like start hitting um, too late of distribution times. And so for validators, too late of distribution times ends up being on that 4 second window because they started testing to things as being unavailable. Whereas for users, nodes that aren't having to attest, it's more like in the 12 second window, like before the next slot do I see that things are available. And so I think any being conservative around that number is, given the like 4844, like everyone downloads everything. Um, where are we going to start seeing uh, blob distributions come too close to that 4 second threshold? And we did some mainnet tests and like think that in that like mm, target max of 3 and 6 blobs, that like things are pretty safe, but definitely you start to see like the latencies making an impact. And so I think anything that we go to mainnet with would be, with the idea to like observe and get actual like real world consistent data, because you can run a lot of simulations and stuff and you can see the simulations are really good at like telling you the relative difference between things, but they don't actually necessarily tell you like the actual like tuning to particular values. So you can run a simulation and be like, oh yeah, this is much worse than that, but you don't necessarily know like how does that actually map onto mainnet. So that that's what we're really going to be looking for when we go to mainnet is like what are our latency distribution times look like, and then
It's quite hard to simulate actual mainnet. I mean,
yeah. And so we spent like 80 grand to send a bunch of large blocks on mainnet, which doesn't even actually look like, because if you pack like a lot of call data into a block, which is what we did, you end up with, here, one second. You end up with just like a very large block being passed around. And so you don't get that like parallelization I was just talking about. And so sending around like a megabyte of blob data is actually probably going to be much more efficient and better latency than sending it around on mainnet today. But again, like we can't, we can make like pretty good guesses, but it's really hard to actually like construct an environment that looks like mainnet before you get to mainnet. So there's that. And then there's like, are there actually iterative, simple things that we can do to like scale that number up a bit more once we get to mainnet, rather than just like doing the same exact thing we're doing right now? So I think in like the 12 to 18 month time horizon, we can actually figure out how to get like a good multiplier on the 4844 scale.
so for me to summarize there, the 3 to 6, of course, is the 1559 construction where we have a target and a max, and the max is double. So it's the same as how we have 15 million gas limit right now, and 30 max. So with 4844, we're going to have 3 blobs and then the max of 6. Um, the
And just to contextualize, three blobs is like 350 kilobytes, max 700 kilobytes. So like you would see on average 350 kilobytes of blob data going out on each block.
And so you're saying like 3 and 6, like at first it was going to be 2 and 4. We've made the just like Ethereum has made the decision 3 and 6 is probably okay and probably in the conservative window still. Like it seems like that's the case from the simulations. And then basically it's an engineering challenge to improve things so that hopefully we can scale that up some and optimize.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of there's a couple of paths. One is like look at mainnet and understand the latencies of 3.6, and if we could safely move up to say like 4.8, and if we can optimize things to safely move up to 4.8. But then there's also like I put out a post the other day called Pure DAS. There's probably things in like this direction of reusing some of the components and making certain like um, I don't know, instead of going to full blown sharding with like 32 megabyte blocks or something, like being able to do some iterative specification improvements that get us to 8 megabyte blocks, that hopefully in the next like 12 to 18 months we can do. So I'm feeling good between like actually seeing this thing deployed in the real world and some of these more simple approaches that we can get increasing scale.
Well, I guess we're getting close to time and I'm running out of material anyway. Should I mean, I guess my question is like, what do you think the chances are that we win here? Because I have to say that I have been shocked at how hard it is to get people. Like, I talked to client like core devs, and they all are like, well, of course, we like all of them became all client teams have become or are in the process of becoming node Lido node operators, and none of them are speaking up. And of course, if you talk to them, they all say like, "Well, it's not. I mean, obviously, we put Ethereum before Lido. We're like we care. We're like, but we have a seat at the table of Lido. But like, they're not speaking up, and I think it's one of these things where it's like, well, we have to be reasonable because we have a seat at the table. But like in the end, like what is being reasonable is, you know, saying ridiculous things about the centralization, saying ridiculous things about the centralization.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
I mean, I would challenge people to speak up. I would, me personally, I'm challenging you to speak up. I'm challenging, people that do have a seat at the table to, compromise their bags for the security of the network, and like say something. Like if all client devs that are involved as being operators say like we need to self limit, then all of a sudden it's gonna be a real conversation. Whereas it's seemingly not today with those, the handful of Lido bag holders that control the vote.
but it's not even compromising your bags because unless your Lido bags are bigger than your ETH bags.
Well, right, yeah. It's compromising revenue source, I suppose, potentially. But as I'll say over and over again, like, Lido will devalue the system. Anything like that that's kind of exceeding these thresholds is going to devalue the system. And so, like, take the system as the top priority, and the Lido bags is the second.
What would you say to somebody who wants Lido to get to 50% so that we can slash them and have Uber ultrasound money?
Is that a narrative? um, it's best to not have to do such things. It would be a mess. Like I say in that post, like these is recoverable, and I know that we will recover in the event that there is like a serious centralization attack like that. But it's best to not go down that path, to not have to.
All right, let's close there. Lido will devalue the system. I think that sums up the content of the last hour and a half.